So, old school Melee was a different beast. The first Melee tier list was released in October of 2002, and we will be comparing the 2021 tier list and see what differences and why there's differences between the two. And I picked 10 characters in this video to show how their placements were vastly different compared to what they were in 2021. You would be surprised. One of the things to know about old school Melee is that the meta was entirely different. Items were allowed in tournament, a lot of stages you straight up wouldn't see today were actually legal. Think of 2002 Melee being a more casual version of the game compared to what it is today. So let's dive right in. Like I said, there will be 10 characters that are being covered in this video, so make sure to watch to the end. Also, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you want more content like this. Number 1, Sheik being the number 1 character in the meta. Believe it or not, the very first best character in Melee back in 2002 was actually Sheik, not Fox. It mainly had to do with Fox's meta being hardly developed at the time. Sheik's meta developed the quickest due to most of the old school players at the time just maining Sheik. Many people also thought Sheik was just straight up easier to play and required less tech skill to be good with, especially back in the early 2000s. Obviously, things wouldn't change as the years would go by. Fox would later become a number 1 character, but it wasn't without their own detractors along the way. Even Mewtwo King himself believed Sheik was the best character in the game back in 2002, and Fox wasn't the most popular character at the time. In fact, many people believed Falco was better than Fox. This was mainly because Falco's lasers could stun, and people thought they were just way better because they could stun their opponents. When in reality, Fox's lasers were heavily overlooked in the early 2000s. This in combination with, obviously people were still playing with items, showing how underdeveloped the meta truly was at the time. Sheik is obviously still a strong character, being a top level character you'll see today in the meta, so there's a positive for that at least. You can't really say the same about the next character. Number 2, Mario being a top tier. Mario was ranked number 5 in the meta. Mario had really simple yet effective combo flows and a pretty easy learning curve, and he was a pretty well-rounded character. Unfortunately though, as the years would go by, Mario would slowly drop from the high tier spot he was previously seen in all the way to number 15, a whole 10 spots lower than his tier list debut. There were clearly way better characters in the meta who clearly just outclassed Mario and did similar things to him and just were better than him. A lot of times people called Mario a diet Sheik. This is mainly having to do with the fact that both characters have a strong down throw and forward air combos, and they both have projectiles. As the years would go by, even characters like Luigi and Dr.Mario would be considered better on the tier list, leaving Mario in the C+ tier. Although you'll see Mario mains every now and then in the modern meta, Mario is not seen nearly as much as probably you would back in the early days of Melee. Number 3, Zelda being over Peach. Believe it or not, Mario isn't the only character who is out of place on the tier list. Zelda is actually number 6 right next to Mario. And I went over this briefly in one of my other videos on Zelda. The reason she was ranked so high was basically because she could transform into Sheik at any time, the best character in the game at the time. Yes, Zelda is ranked above Peach, Falcon, Jigglypuff, the list goes on. People later realized that Zelda on her own isn't a good character. They fixed this in future tier lists as Zelda was slowly dropping in placement. If you want to see a full video on why Zelda is bad in Melee, I made a video about it in the past, but TLDR, Zelda has a lot of undesirable traits, poor movement, horrible special moves, overall a floaty character without many benefits outside of being able to transform into Sheik. Number 4 being Jigglypuff was bottom 10. Jigglypuff was a bottom tier character in 2002. Yes, the spot Donkey Kong has right now, that was Jigglypuff's spot in 2002. This is even more funny because they later made an April Fool's tier list in 2004, placing Puff in the number 2 spot as a joke at the time, stating how the Wall of Pain would be a broken technique in the future of Melee, and it's funny how this became closer to reality where today Jigglypuff is the number 3rd best character in the game, thanks to people like Hungrybox who would push the character in the post-brawl meta of Melee. Many people in the early days just thought Puff was a really bad character because she could lose stocks very quickly, and no one was really pushing her aerial mobility to the highest degree yet. This is overall kind of funny on how bad they just thought Jigglypuff was, but the potential of the character would obviously not be reached until the meta would mature in its later years. Number 5. Yoshi was bottom 7. This one is kinda expected, how Yoshi was generally a slept-on character during the entire lifespan of Melee. It wouldn't be until a Japanese player named Amsa would start taking off sets off top players with just Yoshi. Many people would start eventually to give the character a second look. The thing is though about Yoshi is he's probably one of the hardest characters to get good with because his recovery is pretty strange compared to the rest of the cast. He has a lot of mechanics that only apply to him, like his parry mechanic for example. Those things would be overlooked in Melee for many years. Yoshi was viewed as a non-viable character in the early days. His shield was considered one of the worst shields in the game. A lot of the benefits that the character had in the later years of Melee were simply written off as cheap gimmicks for the time, which again is kind of laughable considering how many people are debating that Yoshi is a top 6 character in today's meta in 2021.
Yoshi is a shockingly underrated character. Like when I think about who's solo mainable, like who could win a major, I cannot rule out Yoshi. I don't feel that Yoshi really gets invalidated to the same degree that some of these these 3 characters that I'm about to list do. And on top of that, I think his potential is insane. I think he's probably still the most untapped character in the game. It's not out of the question, believe it or not, that he rises to like number 6. It's completely not out of the question.
In the later years of Melee, Yoshi would have a handful of players who were pushing the character with a brand new basket of techniques that many people had not fully seen or even utilized the character at that point. This would be the rise of Yoshi in the modern years of Melee, where the character is now seen in top 8s at many major tournaments thanks to people like Amsa. Number 6, Mewtwo being the worst character in the game. In order to contrast with Sheik being the best character in 2002, the worst character in the game was actually Mewtwo. There were hardly any Mewtwo mains in the early years of the character. Even to this day, there are only a handful of top players willing to play the character. For many years, Mewtwo would be in the running for the worst character in the game. This wasn't something that lasted 1 year on a tier list. This lasted even in 2006, where Mewtwo would be ranked as the worst character again. This mainly had to do with the fact that Mewtwo was an extremely light character that wasn't strong enough to offset that weakness, combined with his large tail hitbox, which means he can get clipped by stray moves and hitboxes really easily. Mewtwo was overall a pretty awkward character. People like Taj would later help push the Mewtwo meta, and he would eventually be out of the very bottom tier. While still seen as a bad character in the modern meta of Melee, now he is ranked number 20th out of 26. Captain Falcon in the early days of the meta was seen as a legitimate bad character. It's pretty ironic because most people believe the panelists at the time were biased against the character, because if you know anything about Falcon today, he is not a low tier character. People thought the potential required to be good with Falcon was not possible, and many people thought Falcon was worse than his 64 counterpart. Yes, by the way, you are reading this correctly, Ganondorf was ranked higher than Captain Falcon. This is partly why people think Captain Falcon is a hype character today in the modern meta. It's a leftover breadcrumb of when the character was a low tier back in 2002, so when someone lands a stomp knee and the crowd goes wild, this is why. Because in 2002 they thought Falcon's capabilities could never be reached. In the beginning years, there were very few Falcon mains in the meta, but thanks to people like Isaiah who pushed the character to relevance, Falcon was seen as a competitively viable character in future tier lists. Despite it looking positive for Falcon right now, it wasn't always that way. In the mid-2010s, many players thought Falcon was going to fall off the tier list again because the character was not consistently placing well in tournaments. This led to people trying to push the meta for Falcon even harder than before. This would introduce the more modern meta of the character that you see today, led by people like R.O.B, Nun, and S2J, and many more. The main mindset for going for blind aerials and neutral would be changed with a more defensive and patient playstyle, which was not usually seen with Captain Falcon on the competitive level. This experimentation would work out for the better, as Captain Falcon would eventually win major tournaments and start placing more consistently in top 8s, so the experimentation with the character would eventually work out for the better. Long story is long, but Falcon is still a good character because the character has been through many ups and downs in the Melee meta and has still come through. Number 8. While Ness was never seen as a significantly viable character, however, Ness began on the very first tier list as a mid-tier. A character you would still see somewhat in the meta, but as time would go on, went from placing much lower than he probably was in 2002. He is now considered one of the worst characters in Melee, and this has to do with the fact that Ness has horrible range, really bad special moves, and a terrible recovery. Ness peaked during the release of the game and slowly dropped off to the bottom 5 of the Melee tier list. While Ness has some interesting techniques that no other character can do, these techniques as of 2021 are too hard to master to make the character have any competitive traction. While there are some Ness loyalists with the character, none of them have brought Ness to any real tournament success. Number 9. Luigi. While Luigi has pretty much been in the same place in the meta almost since the launch of the game, however, in the very first tier list of the game, Luigi was actually ranked in spot numbers 6 through 9. He saw a large drop off shortly after that, hovering around 12, 13, and 14. A lot of this had to do with the fact that Luigi has low traction, a predictable recovery, nimble and short reach, and many characters started to develop their own counterplay towards Luigi, leading the character to struggle in the meta. His own brother and alter ego ended up being higher on the tier list, and many of the following tier lists ranked Luigi lower than both of them. However, he wouldn't go down without a fight. This has to do with Luigi mains like Eddie Mexico, A Bait, and many more deciding to actively push the character in the meta, and as the years would go by, people like Shroomed would stop playing Dr.Mario. This would mean there wasn't a lot of Dr. Mario mains going to top 8s nearly as often. This would lead to Luigi finally being placed slightly higher than Doc and Mario, leaving Luigi to still be a mid-tier character in the meta, and as time would go on, he would show that he was truly better than both of them. But Luigi has earned his place in the meta, and it's certainly proved himself along the way, thanks to the people who pushed the character so hard. Number 10. Samus. Samus has always been seen as a mid-tier character. While in 2002 she would have a higher placement than what she would have today, she was ranked number 7. And you can thank a lot of the old school Samus mains back in the day who really enjoyed playing Samus. Samus is usually seen as the gatekeeper of the mid-tiers and high tiers. While Samus can compete with characters like the Space Animals, for example, Samus can struggle in other matchups that kept the character from being seen in plenty of top 8s. Even though Samus had a huge push in the meta in the early days due to so many people playing the character, even people like Hugs getting second place at Melee's first Evo, Samus has a lot of trouble with maintaining competitive relevance in the modern days of Melee. People like Plup and Duck have either stopped playing the character or are less active in the game. Samus struggles in some of the slower paced matchups in the game like Jigglypuff, for example. And while Samus might end up in a top 8 every now and then, the character has too many flawed matchups that consistently keep Samus from placing really highly. Hugs86, a longtime Samus main in the meta, mentioned recently that he's interested in switching to Sheik because some of the Samus matchups are just plain awful. Some of these bad matchups can really ruin a bracket run, so he plans to main Sheik to offset this. So it isn't looking good for Samus, even though there are still some new school Samus mains, but they're not a dime a dozen. Alright you guys, thank you guys for watching the video. If you guys want to get videos early, there's a Patreon in the description where you can join the Discord and get content early. Also, you can talk to me on there if you guys would like. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you want more videos. Thank you guys for watching, and peace.